This is actually a talk that I would like to devote to what is a book which is forthcoming, which is called The Turning Point in Private Law, that I have written with Alessandra Quarta, who is a younger colleague of mine in Torino, and the book is coming out in next September. And it is basically the point of arrival of an itinerary that I've been walking in the last 10 years or so, when I left the field of law and economics, basically, because I was highly dissatisfied from that kind of perspective. So I will try to get to the point, the turning point, through a small reflection about what was my own itinerary in this last 10, 15 years, and in order then to get to see why I thought that there would be some possibilities to transformation through private law, and what I mean from commons to capital and back. The whole thing starts with, as I told you, with dissatisfaction in law and economics. I started my career doing law and economics in the mid-80s at Yale. At the time, it was a very natural thing to do for anybody who had some academic ambitions. It was very easy to find jobs if you were doing law and economics in the United States at the time. Later, I realized that you get persuaded that it's because you are brilliant and smart, but I later realized it was really pretty much of an ideological investment from a bunch of institutions that were pouring conservative think tanks, basically, that were putting money into the law schools and the law departments in the United States in order to turn the legal mind away from the dominant legal realistic model that was very much concerned with an analysis of the legal system based on statutory interpretation and possibility to do transformation through law, and basically challenged the very presence of the state as a potential agency of redistribution in favor of a vision of law that put at the center private law, adjudication, and the value of efficiency, which determined a real somersault, a real transformation in the relationship between the legal system as a body capable to control the economic processes and the economic processes themselves, that from being controlled became the controllers. Okay? And that has been a path that went on in the United States beginning probably in the mid-60s, with the parable of law and economics becoming, originally being a highly interdisciplinary and cutting-edge approach to the law, and later becoming, over time, the mainstream paradigm of legal academia. And in the middle of that, the 80s were the moment of the boom, were the moment in which neoliberalism was actually becoming very strong everywhere. Ronald Reagan was in office, and in the United States, the whole intellectual environment of academia was moving away from the idea that governments and the welfare state could actually serve some functions of redistribution in order to develop a vision of the legal system that was purely property right oriented and private. Okay? At that time, law and economics was a good thing to do if you were not especially critical, or if you couldn't really understand what was going on. But later on, over time, it became crystal clear that that kind of approach was actually a strategy of subversion of the relationship between law and economic order. The economic order being controlled by the legal system has been, the idea of, that was the idea of legal realism, basically, through the agencies and the government agencies. Environmental Protection Agency would be an example. You could actually determine how the economic system works and how you could, in a way, put capitalist institutions in tune with the needs of society to develop in a more cohesive way. We were in the middle of the Cold War. We were in the middle of conditions in which capitalism needed to show that had a very nice face to all over the world, and it could be also an emancipation process. Now, after the triumph of law and economics, we are in a completely opposite situation. It is the legal system that is evaluated according to its capacity to be market-friendly. Okay, so the legal system is not the standard against which you measure the economic system. It is the economic system, the standard against which you measure the legal system. That was the result of this evolution. Today, if you read any law review article in any kind of journal in the United States, especially in the domain of private law, but pretty much throughout the fields, you will find efficiency analysis, which means that the legal system is actually checked against the incentives it gives to individual behavior to pursue a direction that is known and dubbed as efficiency. Okay, this has been a change of very significant importance, and also it has been a hegemonic change in the sense that beginning in the 80s and 90s in particular, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it became really the intellectual vision of the law in the neoliberal era. The law being seen as some sort of a framework for an efficient market. The end of history status was basically reached by this vision of the law as efficiency. It didn't remain in the United States. It went along throughout the periphery and throughout the semi-periphery. Many scholars were flocking in the United States. Young people your age would go to the States, study law and economics there, come back to Italy, to France, to Germany, to Western countries, but also in the Middle East, in the global South, and ultimately challenge their own local legal system according to the values of law and economics, which means according to the values of neoliberalism. Everybody engaged in doing that was actually persuaded to be serving a highly progressive, emancipatory function as a lawyer. Each one of us who was returning in its own country, finding out, legal formalism and finding out all sorts of bureaucratic visions of the legal system, thought to be doing something actually desirable in challenging those kind of ideas against the new creed of law and economics. These all things proved that and created a lot of issues and troubles. Very famous are those that were produced by the so-called law and development movement in Latin America and Africa. That is the most famous of the stories. I assume that everybody knows pretty much what I'm talking about. That was an investment of the Ford Foundation throughout the 60s and 70s to put money into legal education in the global South. The idea of these professors at Yale, at Harvard, and Wisconsin mostly was that it was possible and desirable to teach law according to the American standards also in the global South, which meant to introduce a vision of law that was functionalism, that was legal engineering, that was interpretation out of broad principles to challenge the local bureaucratic formalistic approach. And that proved to be a disaster, especially in those places that were facing dictatorial regimes, because many times formalism and bureaucracy are the very structure of resistance against transformations in favor of power. In authoritarian societies, that was in Italy, came out very obviously during fascism in the 30s and in the 40s. The legal profession, by deploying strategies of strict interpretation, formalism, bureaucraticism, and refusing any sort of policy argument, was actually constructing a barrier against those kind of changes that the regime was trying to put in operation, that were actually pursuing the long-term target of authoritative states. And that was exactly what happened in Brazil and happened in a number of states in the global South, to the point that those people that were engaged in law and development themselves became critical of of what was going on. There had been a very famous article by John Merriman and Mark Galanter, who were among those that were involved in that in that enterprise, actually realizing that sometimes the exportation of American models in contexts that are not of the same kind of structural fabric would be a very dangerous thing to do. With land economics happened a little bit the same thing. Everybody who was doing and studying land economics in the United States would go back and think that his own legal system at home was actually obsolete and was very, very bad. Myself, I realized that at some point, the intellectual processes are difficult to understand. There was a moment in which it became crystal clear to me that a lot of that evolution was not really some sort of invisible hand phenomenon of survival of the fittest model, but it was actually a planned intellectual effort to transform the world according to a certain kind of vision, and that vision was neoliberalism. And the law was actually becoming very much the problem rather than the solution. Many people were believing in the fact that the rule of law was actually some kind of desirable institutional setting per se. There is a huge religion of the rule of law worldwide. And I started to disbelieve this narrative of the rule of law, and I started working not so much with economists, but with other kind of people. I started a relationship with Laura Nader, who is a legal anthropologist from Berkeley, and we wrote a book, it was published in 2008, called Plunder When the Rule of Law is Illegal, that was basically developing this kind of narrative, showing how the legal system and the rhetoric of legality of the rule of law, which everybody everywhere would consider some sort of very desirable thing to do. Think about the World Bank recommendations in the Global South, the human rights discourses, most of the dominant narrative, if you go to any kind of conference by legal professionals, by politicians, rule of law, rule of law, rule of law being something that it was very much desirable. And in Plunder, we're trying to dismantle that rhetoric by using a very simple, basic, quasi-Marxist kind of analysis, seeing the law as some sort of superstructure and looking at what kind of political transformations, what kind of class structures were actually constructed and reproduced by the narrative of the rule of law in a variety of settings. After that book, I came out very depressed. Very, very depressed, because, for anybody who spent so many years, as I did, dealing with the law, ultimately, you kind of have a love relationship with the subject matter of your work. You kind of really are fascinated by its complexity. You even find it beautiful sometimes. You have all sorts of, very weird mental postures towards the object of your study. So I really think that, that I've been a lawyer kind of in love in my own way of the legal system, of the law, as a social phenomenon, as a complex phenomenon of human organization, as a determinant of political processes, possibly as an emancipatory structures, all what each one who decides to go to law school at some point has some desire to study it because has some interest in it, right? And then all of a sudden, you work for 20 years and you see that what you've been loving, what you were caring about was really actually pretty much a bad thing. It's like, it was some sort, almost there was some kind of a betrayal, that you feel from the subject matter of your interest. And I was going around quite a lot. Plunder was a book that was, relatively successful as a book can be a piece of legal scholarship. We're not talking about major successes, but it was a book that was respected, and it originated many invitations to go out there and to talk about it in different places in conditions pretty much like this one, that when you are a little younger, you are happy to do. So I went around a lot to do this kind of presentations, and every single time there was someone in the audience that would say, "Oh yes, professor, your analysis, blah blah." So, but what is the alternative? And, and I had developed a line, and the line was, look, anybody who, I kind of vindicate the right to be critical without the obligation to create a completely alternative system, It is not that whenever I criticize something, I have to produce something as an alternative that is a full-fledged vision, for the very simple reason that the narrative about the rule of law involves, for a few hundred years, a large number of people. And would be completely naive and also a little bit arrogant, to go out there and say, okay, guys, the rule of law doesn't work. Here you are. Now there is the Mattei's vision of the thing, and get it. I was just trying to work in some sort of pars destruens. But when things go on and on and on, and every single time you deliver a talk, there is someone that tells you that you have to give an alternative. What emerges is some sense that as lawyers, probably as intellectuals, we need some kind of pars constraints. Maybe not a full-fledged ones, maybe not like a completely determined theory, but some direction, some vision, something actually what to do, something to do, as my friend Sandy Kadish used to say, what are we here for? Okay, are we here just to say, oh, everybody else is crap, or are we here for trying to give at least a sense of where we should go? So that was the point. And I was, not ready to go back to study with lawyers. I was, I did enough of that. I kind of found my lawyer's colleague a little bit boring and stuff. I was looking for something else, and ultimately I met this guy called Fritjof Capra, whom was a very strange coincidence of life, because the guy wrote a book back in 1975. Those of us who are not young or very young might remember the book. The book was called The Tao of Physics. Was a huge international bestseller. Was translated in like 48 languages. It was a big deal, and was some sort of a little cult, in the generation of those that were, either very young participants in the movements of the late 70s, or the leftovers of the 68 and so on and so forth. So I met that book in 1975 as soon as it was published, because one teacher of my high school at the time, during an occupation, had Xerox copied some parts of it and organized a seminar with the kids, about it. So to me it was like a name, a title, and then I lost contact with the author. So someday I get in Berkeley and I'm there and playing tennis with a guy, and we start finally talking about something different than, the serve and the double fault and whatever. And so, what's your name? And he said, I'm Fritjof Capra. And so I said, oh, are you the author of the Tao of Physics? He said, sure, I am. And so we started a conversation, we go for coffee, and we decided to do something together. And to me that was interesting, because the guy was not a lawyer, was not a social scientist, was actually a theoretical physicist, was an ecologist, had nothing to do with anything of the kind of stuff I would talk to typically with, someone who was in my department or in the nearby departments in my university. And so you kind of, you kind of develop things together that are really cool. So at some point we started thinking about law, and it was there was the economic crisis arrived, very bad, 2007, 2008. All the newspapers around were talking about how all the economists were responsible for all that stuff. You remember, the Queen Elizabeth that said, oh, why you guys didn't understand the crisis was coming. The economic profession was under fire and under attack. And in a way, I think that there was those that were not economists, like lawyers or like scientists, we said, well, we deserve a little bit of blame ourselves. It's not just economists that are the bad guys here. Capitalism is something more and something more complex than a professional group of people, no matter how pushed they are by, the global communication system. But, it is not just about economists. It is about, it's also about lawyers, it's also about scientists. And we started discussing these ideas. And we came out with the idea to develop a 20-hour seminar about the human laws and the laws of nature. In other words, what is the meaning of law if you are a lawyer or if you are a social scientist and you deal with human laws, as opposed to what is the meaning of law if you're not a lawyer, you're not a social scientist, you don't care about that, you are a scientist, but you still use the term law. Because you talk about the laws of Newton, the laws of Kepler, you talk about law anyway, but you have no idea, no connection with that there is any connection with the notion of law as we use it as lawyers. And so we started developing that. And it turned out some kind of interesting, some interesting stuff. Like, for example, this separation between the idea of the laws of nature and the human laws was really pretty much the product of two different professional projects that were developing early modernity. That was basically the fact that hard science gets separated from law. Most of the hard scientists at the time, think about Francis Bacon, the chancellor of the Court of Chancery in England, most important legal figure of the time in England, was actually a lawyer, a very important lawyer, but was also the founder of the positivist method in scientific research. In Italy, people like Avogadro also was both a judge and a scientist, and even Isaac Newton, who was a quintessential genius of science at the time, was also actually, believe it or not, a judge of a court of exchequer, so was dealing with tax law, which is something that is really, really boring, and you cannot imagine something more far away from being a genius and then devote your time to tax law, okay? So it's very strange, this whole thing. So the development of this separation between human laws and laws of nature was actually something that happened as part of the specialization process of modernity, and produced all sorts of really interesting impacts in how the legal system changed. And that was the part with Capra. The part with Capra was not just, the book was published in 2015, it's called The Ecology of Law. Some of you might have heard of it. It is basically does a part that deals with this sort of process of separation, and then says, well, but in fact, the legal system after modernity, because of the mechanistic approach and because of the triumph of positivism as an approach to human understanding, became really pretty much of a machinery of extraction, rather than becoming a system that would encourage people to live together in some sort as a group, okay? So the law became very extractive. The legal institutions that were developed during modernity were actually aimed to transform commons, very abundant at the time, both in their physical essence and in their so to say, social emergence, commons into capital. Commons into capital. Use value into exchange value, for those of you that like these other categories. The idea was basically that the legal system of early modernity, beginning in the 17th century, written down by lawyers that were themselves in strict connection with hard scientists of the time, and I'm talking about people like Jean Domas, who was the great intellectual behind the French Napoleonic Code centuries later, that was a close friend of Blaise Pascal, himself was very connected with René Descartes. All of these guys were living in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam at the time there was Baruch Spinoza, but there was also Hugo Grotius. So there was the birth of international law, the birth of the fundamental theoretical categories of the civil law, contract, property, tort, were all built as new institutions away from the sort of pre-modern tradition of the jus commune that was still very much connected with medieval understandings of life, with use value, with communities, and became legal institution founding and creating the individualistic posture of the modern legal system. And this can be observed very simply in a number of institutions. I cannot get long on this, but for example, not only international law and the transnational corporation was born at the time, and was born as an institution that was free to actually act as a human person in dealing in some sort of natural state of free trade, a natural state of free trade that was for the corporation like breathing for the physical person. The metaphor was carried on by Grotius in the famous discussion of the case Santa Catarina, which was a boat that was basically attacked by the East Indian Company and plundered of a huge amount of money that was, and other commodities out there, boarding outside of Singapore. And then there was this big case in Holland in the Court of Admiralty. The thing was a big scandal because it was an act of attack of a boat over another one, and Grotius was serving as the lawyer, the attorney for the East Indian Company. Was a very smart and talented young man, and he came out with a brief that then became really the foundation of international law called Mare Liberum, in which he basically says, well, because the sea is a common, there is a natural right of access to the common, and certain kind of legal persons must access the common. If someone is precluding them to access them, it's like for someone to precluding a physical person to breathe, try to preclude someone to breathe, and then he has a right to react with violence in order to be able to survive. So that was the idea. So the East Indian Company was actually entitled by natural law to use violence against another ship if the other ship was claiming some sort of exclusive rights on trade lines over the oceans. And this created, an extremely powerful structure for separation of investments from the estate of those that were investing, and produced the early privileged condition of the limited liability corporation that even today, is roaming the world with pretty much the same kind of structure that it was developed at the time. So in the birth of international law and the birth of the separation of the capital of the investors with the capital of the corporation itself, the stock exchange was created and invented in Amsterdam by the East Indian Company, basically, for trading its own shares of participation. That whole thing was actually a powerful, very powerful incentive to invest money and to transform use value into exchange value. The surplus was to be used in order to take major risk, and that was the structure for doing that. But you can find that kind of idea in practically every single institution of private law. It's even too easy, and they will not use that as an example here, to talk about the birth of the absolutist private ownership. That was an institution that developed through enclosures in England and also in the continent, and actually was developed out of a need, again, to transform use value, access to the commons, sharing into exchange value, into producing conditions of an international global trade. There are pages of Polanyi that talk about the great transformation in those terms, are too well known to be reproduced here in a civilized crowd like this one. But that is clearly a very good example of the same kind of process I was observing with the corporation. You can see that in contract law. The birth of the general theory of contracts that was produced in the civil law tradition by Domain and received in the French Napoleonic Code, and constructed and developed in natural law terms in the theory of offer and acceptance. So the idea of binding promises And the idea of a general theory of contract was a radical breach with whatever was out there before. Contract law was typical in Roman law, was based on different forms of action in the civil law, in the common law countries, was not a universal theory of exchange. Contract became the legal structure of exchange with the birth of modernity and with in that kind of years, in which this global transformation was happening. Similar story, you can say, with the fault principle in tort law. Again, there was no theory of negligence, no general theory of fault in the 16th, 17th century. It was developed later. The idea of fault was developed as a shield to take risks, and those risks were actually to be rewarded by letting the bad consequences fall in society in any case in which those risks were considered and deemed reasonable according to the standards of the time. Contract, tort, property, all institutions to transform commons into capital. Use value into exchange value. And in a tremendously effective way. And there were some reasons to do that. There is no one who would argue that there have been no improvements in the conditions of life because of capitalism. There was need to accumulate some capital. There is no question about that. If you don't accumulate capital, you don't build institutions like universities or hospitals or places like that. So there is a need of that. But certainly the process was enormously successful. In a couple of hundred years, we are now in radically opposite conditions than the time. Today, we don't have any common anymore, and we have a massive amount of capital. So we are basically in a condition that is, at the context, which is the polar opposite than the conditions in which we started engineering the laws of modernity. And this is actually, very easy to see. There is no commons from both perspectives of natural commons, let's call them, ecological commons if you want, are actually blinking red. Global warming is just the most famous one, but there is practically no sign that our current economic model of development is at all sustainable, even in relatively short periods of time. The ecological footprint is out of control. The Anthropocene means that in a few thousand years, if there will be an archaeologist, will find this kind of a full layer of plastic around the Earth that was produced by us. And they would say, what they were doing, these guys, they left here a whole kind of thing around the Earth made of plastic, that's the Anthropocene. We got a geological status, in a way, in our capacity to transform oil into plastic. So all of that is very well known. A little less studied, even if similarly powerful, is the transformation from commons institutions in private, individualized institutions. Commons institutions, such as large families, such as guilds, such as corporations capable to factor in the long and the very long run, institutions such as, the communities that were seasoning in Trentino, in the northeast of Italy, the wood that then would be used to build the houses in Venice, sticking it in the water and resisting in the water for 300-400 years. Try to put now some wood from IKEA in the water and see how long will last. Of course, it was a very sustained, long-term collective effort, institutional effort to actually do things whose returns in terms of capital would happen 1 or 2 or 3 generations after. The grandparents cutting the trees that just the grandchildren would sell on the market is something that we cannot even construct intellectually anymore today, exactly because the idea of community, the idea of community in terms of not only of space, but in terms of time, is just disappeared. Clearly, the rhetoric of individual rights, the rhetoric of equality, the Western-centric vision of possessive individualism, the challenge of every kind of institution that is constructing groups, in the global south as against natural rights of the individual. Think about gender relationship is the best known one, but also, all sorts of class structures of societies that were using, labor in quasi-servile conditions, in conditions of reciprocal protection, caste systems, whatever, So all these kind of collective institutions are criticized and challenged. We can see that, for example, still today in attacks that happen at the European Union level against things like, the cab drivers, seen as people that are actually not really on the open market, but because of the medallion, they are a guild, and therefore they are against the free competition and individualization. Or attacks on the notaries. There are all sorts of professions that suffer those kind of critique, exactly because today we have constructed every institution that is not individual-based as an institution that is not desirable from the perspective of capital. It is not a good institution to transfer more commons into capital. The problem is that today, and this I go to the final, to the part that I was supposed to talk about, but I went a little long, but
we still have time.
These things happen. Now the question is that today we are in conditions that are radically different from those of the early 17th century. We have too much capital and we have no common. But we still have institutional systems, especially the institutions of private law, that are actually still structured as institutions of transformation of commons into capital. We still have the same institutional incentives, and indeed, the whole the story that I told you before about law and economics and neoliberalism and privatization and outsourcing and externalization, all those ideas are going faster and faster and faster in the direction of creating more individualization and more transformation of collectivity into individuals, and therefore more transformation of capital into commons into capital, sorry. So this is not really something that is desirable anymore. But how you change? So we are at a point in which now I believe we cannot really survive much longer in this state of affairs. We have to find a way in a different direction. So the ordinary way of seeing things is to say, well, we need law. We need a law that actually, for example, obliges corporations to internalize their social cost. We need, environmental protection. We need more COP21 agreements. We need this, we need that. A very vertical vision of the law from the top down that can be called to actually solve the problem. And I believe that that approach is actually the intellectual offspring of positivism, is actually very much an approach that makes the law becoming much more part of the problem than part of the solution, especially because today the law is completely hijacked by private organized interest. And therefore the idea that some sort of top-down statutory organization produced by some politician anywhere in the capitalist world can actually change the direction in a way that is not in the full interest of capital, and the interest of capital is an imperative, is its own imperative of reproduction. And so it is just some sort of an utopia to believe that the law can be part of the solution from this point of view. But it's also a utopia to believe that we can carry on and go ahead the way we're going. So we are in between two utopias in a way. The utopia of being persuaded that, well, business as usual, we can do it. There is going to be growth once again. We can have infinite growth on a finite planet. All that narrative that comes over and over and over again into policy discourses and so on and so forth. But we also have a utopia on the other hand of saying, okay, if we want to change that, we have to use the legal system from the top down. That is, to me, a vision of the law that is flawed. It is an idea that the law is some sort of an out there, an objective structure in the domain of the facts that can be described, that is separated from us, that is an artifact that lives its life in some sort of an autopoietic way, completely emancipated and free from those that have produced it and those that live under it. In fact, I believe that the law as a positive institution doesn't exist. It's like Santa Claus. Is some sort of a collective belief that there exists such a thing as the law outside of its interpreters, outside of its users, outside of the people that are supposed to obey or to disobey it, and all of that is an optic illusion. The law simply exists as some sort of one of the institutions of being together in society and cannot be separated from us. But the strategy of positivism is separating law and making it live its life as an objective artifact that then can be described and therefore can be depoliticized. So all of this is the problem we are facing. We have very poor tools in order to transform things, yet even the faces you're looking at me, thinking this guy is kind of crazy, what he's talking about, show me very, very clearly that the fundamental belief that there is such a thing as the legal system, and that we can go to someone and ask him, what is the law about such and such? And this one will tell me what is the law in some sort of an abstract way, as if the law existed, is completely rooted in our minds, it's completely rooted in our professional ethos, is completely rooted in our vision of the world, but yet it is exactly what makes the law becoming something that cannot serve the interest of long-term survival. And so I think that we are in front of a quite challenging task, which is to try to do something which is radical, dealing with something like the law, which is very much rooted in our way to see things, has become, this talk has been dramatically Eurocentric, but I did it dramatically Eurocentric, on purpose. Because the law is actually, this is, Pachucanis is still the best analysis of this, is intimately connected with the bourgeois act of commerce. So it is intimately connected and not separable from the idea of the economic transaction. It's part of is a superstructure over an infrastructure, which is those of the means of production, and outside of that, the law is just fantasy. So there is a very strong connection of the law with the means of production, which is it is actually produced. So how are you going to change that? And what should you do? Well, first of all, from the point of view of the vision, it is pretty clear that we have to unmake some of the stuff that were made. We have to go in the fundamental institutions of private law, that are the ones that are less dependent on the top-down production by the political authority, and work out a vision of private law that understands what's wrong with the previous order and tries to introduce a new one. So, for example, property cannot be based on exclusion anymore. The idea that property is exclusion, that was ultimately the evolution of private property in these terms of year, has to be substituted with a vision of property as access, which is something that is not just determined by some sort of a normative vision, but is actually the product of the current transformation of capitalist means of production. In the property as access is pretty much the structure that in the cognitive capitalist organization we're living in, property law is taking. It is what is happening at the frontier of the internet that is where there is this sort of very large controversy between access and exclusion, and that is gonna end up impacting also our life offline, for example. So that would be, in property law, that would be one transformation that we develop in the book. In tort law, of course, tort law is an institutional setting that has institutionalized an ex post vision of social organization. Tort law works in the sense that allows everybody to exercise freely its own individual rights and on the understanding that it is desirable that creativity is, and entrepreneurship is actually facilitated, and then exposed if something goes wrong, there is the possibility to remedy it through, an institutional setting, and transfers in whole or in part the losses where they fall to where they've been produced. That's the fundamental idea of tort law. But this fundamental idea cannot work anymore. Because again, because of technological transformations, today there are so many possible damages that simply cannot be cured. There are so many issues that cannot be sustained by assuming that individual entrepreneurship should be allowed to function completely freely, for the very simple reason that today individual entrepreneurship is not individual anymore, but is corporate. And therefore, it has been involved with the transformation of power relationships between the public and the private, and it has actually determined the fact that there are so many instances in which consequences of tortious action, which means of actions of risk-taking in order to seize a profit, can simply not be cured anymore. Think about the catastrophe of the BP in the Gulf, or the Exxon Valdez, but there are so many others that we can foresee in the next 10 years or so, with artificial intelligence taking over, with the moment of singularity happening, with the consequences of information technology and concentration of power by the big giant corporations of the internet. That is simply something that we cannot handle with tort law anymore. We cannot handle that exposed. The transformations that are determined by smart technology, for example, in the relationship, in the social relationship of every one of us, cannot be cured exposed. They've never been discussed ex ante. We never discussed ex ante what is the impact of letting 12, 13 years old kids being connected constantly with smart devices. We have not discussed that, but that has actually changed the relationship, for example, between parents and children, has changed the relationship in which society reproduces knowledge, has changed all sorts of things that would have required some sort of political discussion, but they were simply not discussed because they were the natural outcome of free entrepreneurship based on individual private property or contract law as constructed back at the beginning of modernity. You cannot cure stuff exposed anymore so much. And so you have to construct institutions of tort law, and these are the kind of discussion we do with the book, that try to change the posture of tort law as in anticipation, in precaution, in a way of measures that we work out a little bit, that change the way in which tort law functions. Third point, contract. Again, contract law is possibly the most significant and dangerous institution of neoliberalism. Through contract law, all sorts of social disasters are happening today under our eyes, and through contract law we justify them very easily. An example that I like to discuss, but there are so many, but one that is quite interesting to me was last year in Berkeley, in San Francisco, turned out that the driver of that was bringing the smart kids to work in Cupertino for Facebook was actually a homeless guy. This guy was actually going to drive the bus, one of those very cool buses that bring the kids to Cupertino from San Francisco, and he would sleep in his car because he couldn't afford to live in San Francisco. But he couldn't afford to also to, go to live far away where he could have afforded the rent, because he had to start at 5 o'clock in the morning to work, and so there was no way that he could do anything else than living in his own car, going to wash in a public toilet, and then dress up and drive these rich children there. But he was an essential part of the structure of production of Facebook, because someone that brings the labor within the firm, it was actually part of the firm. But, so the thing created some stir. Mr. Zuckerberg has been approached by journalists, and he simply said, well, he was not my employee. We just outsourced the system of transportation to another company, and therefore how much this guy is paid is not my problem. Okay? And everybody, from the journalist to the public opinion, say, oh, sure, that's right. He contracted it out. He has no responsibility. So contract law allows us to parcel economic activity in a completely arbitrary way in favor of, the extraction of value without breaking, the unity, once again, breaking the economic unity. Once we would say the organic unity, we cannot use that word anymore because then people will say that we are nostalgic of, whatever. But it's really basically breaking, the economic unity in parts in a way that is totally arbitrary. And, when the Rana Plaza disaster happened in Dhaka 5 years ago, these days, this is exactly what happened again. Those people, Tom Hilfiger, Benetton, that were making obscene profits out of the slave labor of those poor women in that factory that were killed together with their children, paid like less than $1 a day. They said, well, we have nothing to do about that. We just contract it out. We are just actually using the contract in order to produce in an outsourced system, and therefore it's not our responsibility. And they even denied, the participation in the fund in order to compensate the victims of all of that. So contract law is a very, very, very dangerous tool of extraction and needs to be tamed. But the direction in which we are going is exactly the opposite, because for example, in the recent reform of contract law in France, I don't know if there are French people here, but the Code Napoleon was changed in contract law a few months ago, and they took away la cause. That was actually the only prerequisite of contract law that could allow to introduce some sort of social function to the contract, because the World Bank, through doing business report, has said that la cause is actually unfriendly to the market and therefore will make business go away from France and go elsewhere. And so the reform took away the cause from contract law. So there is where we are. The directions of transformations are pretty clear to see. The point is how you do that. And here, and I'm going to close on a very sort of Gramscian mood. Also, I don't want to get into detail about the book more than what I did, but because I'm more interested to share with you the itinerary. The problem is that, I can see very clearly that the legal system, being part of us, and being just an abstract operation, that of dividing us from the legal system, is a strategy of irresponsibility. When we go to buy to Benetton, when we go to be consumers at whatever, in those shops, we have no understanding whatsoever that we are part of the system of contract law that works and sustains those kind of extractions. And so there is certainly something to say and something to learn about all the strategies of boycotts that have been taken over and been used, for example, when people were very disenfranchised, because we are very disenfranchised. Corporations have disenfranchised us almost entirely, but we still can learn something from, the strategies of disenfranchised people. For example, the boycotts of the black women in Harlem in the 30s and the 40s against the meat packaging, against, the companies that were not giving labor to their children. Those were extremely effective strategies to actually vote with the economic power by people that were whose subjectivities, however, were constructed as group subjectivities. Okay. The point here is, to me, and this is what we try to do in the book, is to understand that what is making the legal system the way it is a professional ideology around it, and so we have to enter into that professional ideology to try to use it in some sort of a counter-hegemonic way. This might not be the time of the war of a full-fledged war of movement, in transformation of capitalism, but it is, to me, the time of war of position. That is to say, in Gramscian terms, is it the time to actually enter into the mechanism and transform it from the inside in such a way to exploit its own internal contradiction, to try to steer it in a direction that is different, in a diffused way, without waiting for some kind of a top-down moment of transformation, but actually seeing that the turning point is actually a series of turning points. Okay, I'm stopping here. Thank you so much.